Alrighty, 8th graders, this is it. It's our last video notes. Very sad. Gonna hold all the tears till the end. Before we get started, real quick, make sure you have all your work in for this week by Friday. On Friday, I'm gonna post, I think, the final assignment that you'll have for me, and it will be due a little bit earlier. It won't be due a Friday on the final week. It'll be like in the mid part of the final week, so I have to have time to grade everything. I think Ms. Gooder made the cutoff Tuesday. Mine will probably be Tuesday or Wednesday. Would be when I'd like to have everything in, just so I get everything in order. I can grade late work that way, that kind of stuff. You know the drill. I encourage you to go beyond just looking in your book for the Vietnam open note / book test answers. You should kind of read through that, because I think Vietnam is kind of an interesting war. It's not really covered as much in classes, and unfortunately we did not get to cover it the way that I wanted. I'm going to try to save my rant till the end. Sorry. We left out talking about the civil rights movement. We had just talked about the Little Rock Nine, those kids going to desegregated schools. We'll also talk now today about this bus boycott and some other things. So, public transportation, the reason why this boycott happens, it was still segregated, right? You weren't allowed to sit at the front of the bus if you were a black person. This is where famously Rosa Parks gets arrested for, in protest, refusing to give her seat up, right? In response to this, African Americans begin boycotting buses. They don't want to ride these buses, and they were a huge part of that income. And so now, with them out of the picture, there's a lot of issues with the bus company. They lose 70% of the ridership during this protest. There's people are met with violence. There are threats. People are going to be having trouble getting to work. A lot of these African Americans couldn't afford transportation. It was a huge issue, and it leads to a Supreme Court eventually ruling that segregation is illegal on public transportation. So in a lot of ways it does eventually bring about change, but again, we talked about before, it's one thing for the Supreme Court to rule it, it's another thing for it to be actively enforced, right? And this was just one of the ways that people are protesting these issues with civil rights at the time period. Another way is through sit-ins, right? So at diners and things, seats up at the front counter used to be places where only white people were allowed. And so you started to have protest movements there where, especially in the southern communities, these black people would come and they would sit at the front counter, and these places would refuse to serve them. In some cases they were harassed, they were forcibly removed. In this picture you have people dumping food and things on them, and there are white people who joined and sat alongside them in protest. So it's not just black people doing these protests, it's white people helping protest for them, right, or with them. Due to news coverage, starts to pick up everywhere, and people started to protest it, not just in North Carolina where it started. And these are, again, non-violent protests, right? They're not fighting back, they're just sort of sitting there and in ways taking the abuse, but it doesn't muddy the message with violence, right? It makes them look like they're being the better person here. And it does win some people over, but it also draws attention to it. Every time one of these scenes happen, and this news coverage happens, it's drawing attention to what's going on in some of these southern states. It's drawing attention to the issues of racial inequality there that a lot of people weren't as knowledgeable about, right? Remember, a lot of people in the North are kind of ignorant of the things that were happening in the South. They weren't aware of these situations, right? The election of 1960 is huge. If you have a chance, I would look YouTube Kennedy-Nixon debate, because it is a very interesting presidential debate. It is the first one that is televised, so Americans can watch these people debate for the first time ever. And there's a lot of debate over the reaction to this, because people who, and this is an example of knowing the audience, I guess, people who listen to these debates on the radio said that Richard Nixon sounded like, on average, overall, they tallied people, they polled people who listened to it. People listening on the radio, the majority said they felt Nixon sounded like he knew what he was talking about, sounded more presidential, liked his ideas, that kind of stuff. The people who watched the debate came out of it saying Kennedy was the better candidate, who sounded more presidential and things. And it came down to how they presented themselves. And the thing is that Richard Nixon, while he's a good talker, and eventually he does go on to be president, he did not understand the effects of being in a televised debate. It never happened before, right? And one of the big differences is that when John F. Kennedy went on this debate, he wore a bunch of makeup. He understood he's going to be under these hot lights. He knew it's going to affect his complexion, his skin, right? And Nixon refuses, and if you watch like the highlights in the YouTube videos, he looks like he's like sweating to death. He's got a greasy face going on. He looks like he's sort of not as trustworthy. You get that impression that he's like really struggling to answer, right? And John F. Kennedy comes out looking really smooth and prepared and calm, right? And it's the difference of knowing what it's like to be on television under those big bright lights, right? And it is an interesting debate just in that how they handle some of these questions. And John F. Kennedy's a very, very young candidate, and while he appealed to a lot of people, there was some concerns over things like his religion, right? He is the first president to be Catholic, right? Not the first person to run. That was Alfred Smith, I believe. But he's a Catholic, and there were some concerns over, does that mean the Pope has control over the President of the United States, which is a weird sort of a concern, right? Kind of in ways it's almost like insulting if you're a Catholic to think that people would worry about that. But, he had to deal with that as well. And Kennedy gave a lot of younger Americans sort of hope just in the fact that you're talking about this relatively young new president has some pretty interesting ideas, and in some ways he's going to be pretty successful, but in other ways he's also responsible for some pretty big blunders and also the closest that we'll ever get to nuclear war, talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So there's good and bad with Kennedy. Also, obviously, famously, he will eventually be assassinated, right? But he called, sort of his plan was part of this thing called the New Frontier, right? He wants to improve Tennessee's economy, wages, education. Not all of his improvements get through Congress. There's this issue of funding some of these ideas. He was big on campaigning for civil rights, but he was slow on actually getting some of that changed. And not all of it's his fault, but there is this idea of like, people expected him to make the changes he said he's going to make, and in some cases didn't really go through, right? Also responsible for the funding and big initiative for the race to the moon landing, right? 1969 we will land on the moon thanks to some of the efforts put in place under the Kennedy administration, right? But at the same time, he has to deal with further civil rights protests, things like the Freedom Rides. So this was a cross-country protest where they rode to segregated, bus stations and stops and used the facilities that were for the inappropriate color types, right? So people who were colored black went to the white-only facilities, and white people used the ones that were, for what they call, quote, colored people, right? And it caused a lot of violence in these southern communities again, and they were met with, protests, and, they were attacked, their buses were attacked. And it not only did it draw attention again to this, but it kind of forced Kennedy to act on this, civil rights thing. And so he had to enforce the ban on segregation and transportation, made him unpopular with, racist white Southerners, but again, he's looking at, what are you supposed to do if you're president and you have, people in your own country like willing to kill each other over, racial issues. It's not a great look for most presidents, right? And that's a thing you have to sort of deal with. And very famously, there was a protest in Birmingham, and Martin Luther King is jailed for marching without a permit. That's the law he technically breaks. And from there, he explains his opinions on nonviolent protests. There's a very famous letter called The Letter from Birmingham Jail, where he talks about, why it's important not to fight back and how it sort of muddies the message and things. And there are some real cruel video clips, cruel, not cool, that come out of this protest. I mean, you can see them like sicking attack dogs on people. People are getting sprayed with fire hoses and the amount of water coming out of those, you're knocking people down, you're like ripping skin off people in some places. I mean, these are not, these are protests that are not received very well by people who are enforcing the law at the time in these places. And it's kind of horrifying to watch how, badly some of these people are treated. But remember, the key here is, again, during these Birmingham protests, when they were being, dogs were being sicked on them, they're being shot with fire hoses, they still maintain that non-violence, right? Not responding with violence, not rioting, not attacking these police officers. It's all about peaceful protest, and it sort of helped to rally a lot of sympathy towards the cause of civil rights, especially for people who maybe didn't necessarily care about it as much before. They see it on TV, they see how they're being treated, they start to, feel more sympathy, feel more inclined to help these people who, maybe not be as involved. There's also the big famous March on Washington, where MLK gives the famous "I Have a Dream" speech. There's a number of people who go up there to speak. Huge civil rights march. You can see the people, in this picture going all the way back at this the Washington Monument in the background, right? Congress is still kind of torn because there are a lot of people who are in positions of power in the South who it's not part of their agenda to help with civil rights, and that's part of the reason why this is slow to change, right? At this point, you're almost 100 years after the Civil War, and you still have this black versus white opinions in the South. And one of the things to sort of restore, unity in the South was the idea that Kennedy wanted to take a tour of southern cities, sort of show his face as president, and it's there that he is assassinated, right, in Dallas, Texas. The footage that's also online, I would not watch it. That's gruesome, right? He gets shot in the head. You can imagine it doesn't look good. Lee Harvey Oswald is, arrested for the murder of John F. Kennedy. It is a really sort of tragic moment in American history. People turn on their TVs to hear about this. The news coverage of this upset a lot of people. And all of a sudden, Lyndon B. Johnson, the vice president, is being sworn in, promising to continue, right, Kennedy's work. But, it's a pretty powerful loss. The Kennedys are a political dynasty. They're involved pretty heavily in United States politics. And, it was a pretty big loss for, the family, but also, the American political parties in general. Right? Very rarely do you have a president get assassinated. When you do, it's a big deal. Even if you didn't like the guy, people were upset that, he's killed, right? And there's all sorts of, long-term implications and things of that, but not enough time. So, also Civil Rights Act, 1964, it's going to ban further segregation and discrimination. Voting rights are still not being protected in areas in the South. There are activists who are being murdered by, that returned Ku Klux Klan at the time period. But it steps in the right direction. Coming along with that is the Voting Rights Act, a way to try to expand and protect voting rights for Southern blacks. And within 3 years, more than half of black people in the South are registered to vote. After the passing of that act, that's a huge growth in voter base, right? In terms of what you have, who you're going to have vote for you. That's a whole new group of people that they need to make sure that if you're a politician now, you have to keep their interests in mind too. Otherwise, they're not going to vote for you, right? So even people who maybe didn't necessarily care about, black people in the South, now there's a huge voting base. You kind of need to, right? Or at least look like you need to, because if you want them to vote for you, you got to, convince them, right? It's a big deal. It's a step, in the right direction towards the civil rights movement. LBJ's plan was called the Great Society, by the way. And he wins election, 1964, not re-election, because technically being sworn in after Kennedy was killed did not count, right, as a first term. And he pushes for additional reforms. He creates Medicare and Medicaid, which is health care for elderly and low-income people. It's still around today. It's the thing, when you get a paycheck someday and you pay into that, right? He's also going to provide more funding for schools and housing for people. wants to sort of level the economic playing field a little bit. In some ways, it's successful. In other ways, it's the same problems we talked about before. It's easy to want all these programs, nothing to actually fund them, right? There's also a different civil rights movement that's not associated with Martin Luther King, and that's the Black Power movement. You have people like Malcolm X, pictured here, who's in charge of this civil rights movement, and this is one that is not for integration. They don't want to necessarily integrate and become like white people, and instead it's this idea of like, be yourself. Don't change to be what society wants them to be like. And Malcolm X was the leader of the Nation of Islam, which was an organization that pushed for black equality in the United States. But unlike MLK, Malcolm X is an advocate of using violence if necessary. It's a very different, perspective on how to handle these things. He felt like nonviolence doesn't get the job done, that by responding with violence you get more attention, and that increases the knowledge of your movement. And it too was very popular with people. But this also has the downside of like scaring off people, right? Or confirming the fears of these racists, right? If you have someone who's racist against black people and these protest groups are being violent, that kind of fuels their argument against them, right? So it's not, it's not a perfect system, but it definitely was effective at recruiting people and, helping in some ways with the push towards, civil rights. Ultimately, both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. are murdered, right? Assassinated, killed. Malcolm X leaves the Nation of Islam, and 3 of its members actually kill him, whereas Martin Luther King Jr. is shot and killed in Memphis by people who don't necessarily agree with his point of view, right? And the reaction to assassinations like this is very similar to Kennedy's in that you have a lot of very, very upset people, but there are a number of riots in American cities in response to these assassinations and these murders, right? And kind of in a sort of sad way, because obviously what Martin Luther King teaches and what he taught and preached to people was the importance of not resorting to violence. Yet after his murder, there are these wide-scale riots. So it's sort of the opposite of what he wanted. But it is a period of change, right, in the United States, and ultimately change for the better does come, but it was a very slow process, and arguably that process should have happened during Reconstruction. But we talked about at the end of 7th grade year, Reconstruction didn't really succeed, right? The fact that it took to the 1960s for civil rights to really make progress in places of the South is good evidence of that. So that's the end of our notes on civil rights. Like I said, I would make sure that you at least read through some of the Vietnam stuff, because there are some really interesting parts of it. Off the top of my head, there was one activity that I wish we could have done in class where we looked at some of the protests that went against Vietnam, because you have people who self-immolated, right? These monks who literally lit themselves on fire, burned themselves alive in protest, and there are photographs of it, and they're powerful photographs. They're definitely something you look at and you're like, okay, clearly you don't burn yourself alive unless you care very strongly about whatever it is you're doing that for, right? There's a lot of photographs we would not be able to look at from Vietnam because, frankly, they're not appropriate to look at in school, in my opinion. I mean, there's some gruesome stuff that happens as a result of that war. You have the use of napalm on cities. You have, killing of civilians. You have the My Lai massacre. People who are innocent being killed. It's a difficult time for the United States. Fitting that we have to end the school year on that, but it is what it is, I guess. So make sure you get all that done. It really sucks that this is the end of your 8th grade year, and it sucks for you. It sucks for your teachers. I mean, you guys are a fairly small class, but you're definitely one of the better ones that I've ever gotten to teach. And for us to be sort of robbed of the end of your year before you move into high school sucks. There's no other way to put that. You'll do well in high school. Hopefully we'll have normal school again soon. But we kind of don't get that closure of like ending the year together, and that bothers me, I guess. So just know it's been a fun 3 years, and I'll miss you guys when you're in high school. And you know where my room is. You can always come by and see me. Stop by and say hello. If you need help with history, you know where I am. I'm gonna end this video so I don't cry on YouTube. But I hope you've enjoyed this wonderful COVID video. Get your work done. Have a good day.